Right, thanks, Dirk. So I'll talk about today about some work we have been doing with stroke patients over the last few years, and in the end, I will throw in an imaging study to make things more exciting. So we study communication. So communication is defined. One of the definitions is communication is meaningful interaction. Right? So ultimate purpose of communication is to convey meaning, send information, get information. Right? So we talk about phonology or morphology or syntax, and all these things are of course important, but ultimately they are used in service of meaning. So because of that, large territory of the brain is involved in representation of meaning and retrieval of meaning. So when we use the word semantics in daily language, oftentimes people think of it as kind of haggling about details of meaning, right? So them are fighting words unless they're just semantics, right? So we don't want to say it is just semantics, because semantics refers to everything that you know, everything, or your acquired knowledge about the world. So what you know about people, things, relationships, of course, words and meanings of words, cultural knowledge, and so on. So it is quite a critical and large repository of knowledge that we have that is part of the semantic memory. If you look at the brain basis of semantics, this kind of studies, this is an example of a meta-analysis that reveals a number of different areas covering the temporal lobe and inferior parietal lobe, some areas in the frontal lobe also in representing semantics. And this is semantics in general. So we are not talking about any specific type of things, any specific actions, things like that. But if you average over everything, what do you find? Well, you find this. Roughly speaking, these are the kind of areas you might say are critical on the, at least on the lateral side of the brain. They are critical for semantic knowledge on average, averaging across all kinds of different things. You might think of this as the conceptual system or the semantic system, and this is oftentimes contrasted with the perceptual or sensory motor system. So in between here, if you can see the arrow here, this is the motor cortex. So this is your action system. Oops. And here you have the visual system. On the temporal lobe here, you have the auditory system. So these systems are thought of as separate from the conceptual system. So that view would be this, that you have a cognitive or conceptual system on the one hand. This is independent from your perception and action systems. Right? And there is another view that is also become popular because of large amount of experimental evidence that these systems are not actually that different, that completely separate, but they are tightly intertwined. And in fact, when you talk about semantics, you are leveraging your perception and action systems in order to perform semantic tasks. So not independent, but tightly intertwined or interdependent systems. So this is a different view. Now, to address this, we can look at the domain of action concepts. So one idea would be that if you are comprehending or producing action-related language, do you actually use the action system of your brain? So do you use your motor cortex in the brain? So one view is that maybe some abstracted versions of simulations of actions that you are talking about or you are trying to understand are performed in the brain, which enables you to actually understand what is being said. So what is meant by the word throw? To understand that, you would use some part of your motor system actually to perform an abstracted simulation. We are asking whether there is any relationship between processing action words an actual performance of actions. Right? So this kind of, you would predict that if you have problems with performing actions, maybe you would also have at least some level of deficit with comprehension or production of action-related language. Right? This would be quite remarkable in the sense that we think of these things as completely different. So in this study, we looked at performance, action performance in patients with left hemisphere stroke. So at the time we had 41 patients, and they performed a number of different motor tasks using an exoskeleton robot that allows precise measurements of their movements. So we can measure how skilled or how impaired they are in performing very simple to very complex actions. And then the same patients were also tested on a word comprehension task. So we can relate whether their word comprehension performance has anything to do with their physical action performance. So this is an example of a task. This was all done in the lab of Troy Herter, who has these really cool robots that enable very nice measurements of actions. And this is a reaching task. So in this, in the X, the subject is located initially in the center, holding a handle, and then they are asked to reach in one of the four directions. And you can see in this bottom right here that this is a patient who is severely impaired. So their paths look all kind of messed up. They are not able to go from here to here in kind of more or less straight line, versus other patients have very little impairment and their paths look very smooth and straight. So this type of a task gives a number of different, there are a lot of things you can measure about this, how well they perform the task. But some of the central measurements are the total movement time, that how long it takes you to move, number of speed maxima. So if the movement is kind of herky-jerky, reaction time, initial direction error, whether you are starting out in roughly the right direction or you are starting out somewhere and then correcting it. So these four are sort of central measures, and there are a number of others as well. And then we tested them on a number of different tasks, conceptual tasks that simply involve behaving, comprehending words. This was done offline, so not at the same time as well, while they were doing the motor tasks. And we wanted to have something that is kind of a semantically implicit task. So this is lexical decision, where you don't need a lot of semantic knowledge in order to decide whether something is a word or not. Then we have a more explicit task, semantic tasks that actually requires you to understand meanings of words and compare meanings to see which one is more similar. So that is the SSJ task shown here. And then we had a number of different types of sentences. So in the sentence verification tasks, we had sentences that used action verbs like pinch or run or throw or so forth. There were literal action sentences that describe an actual action, or we had metaphoric actions where there is no actual action, but you are just using it as a metaphor. And we have idiomatic, and then abstract sentences that don't have an abstract verb, so they don't have a very strong relationship with actions. So these abstract sentences are used as a control condition. And when we compare action performance of patients with their semantic performance, we find that number of these measurements are related. So patients that perform worse in the reaching task in action performance are also worse in action semantics relative to abstract semantics. So lexical decision tasks, for example, and verb priming are related to total movement time, how long it takes them to move. And the semantic similarity judgment tasks, which are explicitly semantics, are also related to some of the measures like reaction time or initial direction error. So implicit tasks, which are priming and lexical decision, correlated with kind of global action parameters like total time, and more explicit semantic tasks with more specific action parameters, which would suggest that the simulation that you might be performing has more detail in it, and therefore specific action parameters predict how good your performance is. We also had more higher level, higher order kind of action tasks that require more planning of actions, planning and coordination of two hands. So one task is this object hit task, where you have a screen and these objects are falling from away from you towards you, these red dots, and you have two handles, and it is like a video game where you are required to hit as many of these red dots as you can. So that was just hit as many as you can. And there is another task, which is object hit and avoid task, which also has distractor objects. So there are things like triangles and squares that you are not supposed to hit, while you are supposed to hit as many circles as you can. So this makes it more complex, requires more planning, more decision making. So in this task also you have number of measures, but some of the main measurements are going to be hand bias in hits. So whether you are very biased in using one hand or the other, or in your movement area or in speed. And in this, with this task correlated with the sentence processing task, always using abstract sentences as a control. And the object hit task mainly correlated with the literal action sentence processing, whereas the object hit and avoid task, which is the more complex action task, correlated with idiomatic sentences to a greater extent. So idiomatic sentences correlated with the object hit avoid task that requires more action planning, more executive processing, and more coordination between arms in order to do it efficiently. And this seems to be associated with higher order semantic processing. So sentence task with more complex actions requiring bimanual coordination and planning correlated with the complex semantic task. So type of stimulation or type of access that the motor cortex is used for seems to be dependent on what task you are doing. It is not simply that if certain words are present, that certain parts or certain simulations are going to take place. It depends on the task and the context, how you use your sensory and motor systems in doing comprehension. Okay, so this we were looking at the motor behavior and semantic performance. So now we can look at damage to the brain and how that damage in which areas lead to deficits, potential deficits in semantic performance. A lot of the studies that I'll talk about from here on out are all done by Nick. So he's doing a great job doing lesion-symptom mapping as well as fMRI. So in this study, we also had the semantic similarity judgment task, where again you have one word at the top and you are expected to select the word that is most similar at the bottom, and we have action triplets like this, and we have the abstract triplets again that work as a control for general processing of words, executive processing, decision making, and so on. So in this study, we had lesion maps for 40 patients included in the study. The lesion coverage shows kind of a standard MCA territory, but note that even the temporal lobe is included in this. And we defined two networks of interest, so two regions of interest and also networks of interest, where we expect that where the action semantics and abstract semantics might be most based on. There is most evidence that these type of semantics are actually based in motor related areas in the motor cortex, or posterior temporal areas also often come up in action semantics. And the reason for defining these regions is that when we look at networks, if you look at connectivity of every region to every other region in the brain, you have a huge number of, you have what is called a combinatorial explosion. So you have millions of connections, and then when you correct for multiple comparisons, you are practically guaranteed that nothing will survive. So it makes sense to look at areas that are most likely to be relevant to your hypothesis. So we are going to look at these regions at a whole brain level, as well as networks that connect these regions with each other. And we looked at connections. When I say connections, this is resting state functional connectivity. We have a very nice connectome developed by Leo Bonilla's lab that gives us connectivity strength between all of these regions. So we looked at left-to-left connections, right-to-right connections, and also left-to-right interhemispheric connections. All right. So when we do the whole brain VLSM for action accuracy, and this is regressing out accuracy of the abstract task. So these are just the residuals from the multiple regression. This is all made possible by these guys who have a wonderful software that makes everything easy. So when you show this to someone, it looks impressive, but actually it is very easy to do thanks to these guys. So what we find is we don't actually find any. Our hypothesis was that, okay, motor cortex, some type of primary or secondary motor areas are going to be, when they are impaired, your action semantics will be impaired, but we didn't find that. Instead of that, we find this kind of a deep white matter area in the anterior corona radiata, right? So it is in a way it is puzzling, but looking at other results, lesion symptom mapping studies in stroke patients specifically with action semantics has been inconsistent. So some studies find it, some studies don't find it. So in a sense, it is puzzling why this is the case and why this particular region shows up. But when we look at connectivity, we might get an idea of why what's going on. We find only, first of all, only interhemispheric connections were significant. So nothing left to left or right to right, but only left to right connections. And the connections that were significantly predicted the impairment in action performance were going from the left IFG to the right hemisphere motor areas. So you find the left IFG, and the posterior IFG especially is associated with a complex action performance and action observation. But of course, it is a very familiar area that is implicated in language processing. Some people think of it as a syntax, important for syntax, but also shows up for other kind of hierarchical processing, which includes complex actions, but other things like speech or music that has hierarchical structure. So when this area's connection is impaired with the motor area in the right hemisphere, one of those areas is the anterior IPL. And this is sort of not a classic action area, but when you look at the literature, you realize that it is very frequently found with all types of deficits or brain activations in healthy subjects when we are talking about complex actions. So when you need to plan actions, or when the actions are complex that require coordination between objects and the hand, or the hand-eye coordination, then this area is very commonly activated. And if you get damage here, you get deficits in action performance, performing especially complex actions. You get limb apraxia. So this is this area also shows up very commonly in our imaging studies. And the other area we get is the precentral gyrus, which is of course the kind of standard action area and associated with action schemas. So this was, in a way, this can explain why you might get a negative result in terms of damage to the left hemisphere areas. So this kind of thing suggests that the right hemisphere can be used to compensate for impairment in the left hemisphere through interhemispheric connectivity. And so it shows that motor areas do play a role in action semantics, just that if you have unilateral damage, the other hemisphere may be able to compensate. But if your connectivity is also impaired, then the compensatory process doesn't work as well, and the right hemisphere is not able to get what it needs from the right hemisphere, and that's when you see the most severe deficits in semantics. So this suggests an important role of connectivity, that it's important to look at connectivity in addition to lesion location. And in lesion deficit mapping, if you get any negative results that were based only on looking at lesion locations, that's not necessarily conclusive because of the importance of connectivity and possibly compensatory processing. All right, and on the reverse side, we also looked at the abstract semantics. So what predicts greater deficits in abstract non-action related semantics relative to factoring out action semantics? And we get only one area, which is the anterior temporal MTG, anterior middle temporal gyrus. And this is significantly, the damage here will predict impairments in abstract accuracy. So this leads to kind of, I'm going to switch gears a little bit and now talk about the anterior temporal lobe a little bit more, because this has been kind of suggested as a hub for semantic system. So when we are talking about action semantics or other kind of semantics, visual semantics or smell related semantics, these are all kind of sensory specific areas. But there is a view that there are hubs that integrate all of this information that is in different parts of the brain and kind of bring it all together. So this is a critical region for semantics. And this is thought to be a transmodal or pan-modal hub, which means that it is activated no matter what modality you present the input in. So it could be visually presented, auditory words, written words, doesn't matter. If it is semantic, then it's going to be activated or it's going to be important. And the older view, the original view was that the entire ATL is a hub and it's critical. And the more updated view is that the whole ATL is not a hub, but within the ATL here on the kind of bottom, slightly posterior location on the ventral surface of the ATL is sort of the most sort of true hub, which is truly transmodal and truly semantic, perform semantic integration. And other regions of the ATL show a gradient. So you have a gradients going from this kind of a central hub to other parts of the ATL, which show more or less different kinds of gradations, functional gradients for different kinds of semantics. So we wanted to test this using stroke patients that we have, and we tested them on a number of different tasks. And here we are choosing 3 tasks: lexical decision, the semantic similarity judgment task with words, and then the pyramids and palm trees task with pictures. And the reasoning behind these tasks is that we wanted to manipulate the factor of lexicality versus semantic load. So lexical decision is a lexical task, but it doesn't have a lot of semantic load. You don't really need to know a lot about the word. Versus semantic similarity judgment task is lexical task, and it also has a high semantic load, because you really need to compare different what means, what is similar to what. You need to understand the meaning clearly. And then the pyramids and palm trees task also requires you to understand the items, but it is not a lexical task, right? So we can potentially distinguish semantic processing from lexical processing. And this is the coverage. This study had 63 patients. We had coverage again going through all the way through the ventral ATL. And the prediction is that ATL damage should lead to impairment in both semantic tasks. So if the semantic hub, the true hub area is damaged, it should knock out, it should severely affect semantic tasks, which are here the SSJ, the semantic similarity judgment using words, and PPT using pictures, right? But it shouldn't affect so much the lexical decision task, which doesn't really rely so much heavily on semantics. Okay. So what we find is that we use 2 of these tasks as to co-vary out performance of one task from the other to see kind of the unique contribution from the other task. And when we use the lexical decision performance regressing out the PPT task, we find that damage to ATL predicts worse performance in lexical decision when PPT is regressed out, and damage to this kind of inferior parietal areas, we can call it temporoparietal junction regions. This predicts worse performance in the PPT task, right? So this is not what would be predicted by the previous account, which would predict that the more heavily demanding semantic tasks should be impaired by damage to ATL. When we compare lexical decision with semantic similarity judgment, again, for the heavily more severe semantic tasks, we get the kind of temporoparietal regions, and with lexical decision, we get ATL, this time kind of ventral ATL in addition to the temporal pool. So another way to look at this is to look at damage, percent of voxels damaged in this region. So the ATL region of interest versus the inferior parietal TPJ region of interest. And so what is shown here is the percent of voxels damaged and then plotted against the accuracy. And the check marks show the significant predictors. So you can see that the lexical decision and the semantic similarity judgment task, both lexical tasks, are impaired more with damage to the ATL, whereas the semantic similarity and the PPT tasks, more heavily semantic tasks, are impaired with damage to TPJ. Right, so we get a kind of a graded trend of lexical decision, SSJ, PPT. So this type of result suggests a role of ATL more in lexical access, right? Just because you are required to process words and access meaning through words rather than transmodal semantics. And there are a couple of caveats here, which is that we didn't have complete coverage in terms of our strokes, complete coverage of the anterior temporal lobe. So we didn't have strong coverage of especially the medial aspects of the ATL. We did have lateral and ventral ATL covered. So maybe that area is more important for non-lexical semantics. And another possibility is always that it is bilateral. So if damage is to the only if you have unilateral damage, maybe the other hemisphere can do the work. There is a related study that was done by RG and Julius and colleagues, and in this study, this is similar, but they compared the auditory word recognition subtest, which involves matching an auditory presented word with a set of pictures. Right. So this is is both lexical as well as semantic task, and then they had a PPT also, and the auditory word recognition subtest shows ATL as well as TPJ regions, which is consistent with what we found. But in that study, the PPT also shows a small cluster in the medial ATL. So this would suggest that perhaps medial ATL is more important for non-visual semantics. And this study had much larger sample, I believe around 150 patients. So they had more power. So it is possible that medial ATL is perhaps important for non-visual semantics. But at least we didn't find any single region that would predict both PPT as well as the SSJ impairment. All right. So finally, we decided to do an fMRI study to look at this, because with stroke you always have this question of bilaterality and compensation. If you don't find a deficit, you can always argue around it. In fMRI, I can show you activation in both hemispheres that would suggest that perhaps a certain process is bilateral versus unilateral. We did an fMRI study with the same kind of logic, using some semantic items as well as some lexical items to see what's being activated. But there is an issue with fMRI studies of ATL. in that oftentimes ATL is not found to be active in studies of semantics. Some studies find it, many studies don't. So it is kind of surprising. But there are two arguments against this. One argument is that you get signal loss in ATL if you are using your normal fMRI scanning parameters. So especially in the ventral and medial parts of the ATL, you tend to have weak signal. Dorsal and lateral ATL, in fact, has pretty good signal. But maybe if those ventral regions are the more critical, then we are not measuring signal from there. And then, of course, then you get negative results. So it is not surprising. And the second issue is that when we perform whole brain correction, that whole brain correction is too harsh. So that will take out any kind of small clusters that you may have within the ATL. So on a side note, with respect to this whole brain correction issue, if you talk to anybody who works in statistics or methods, fMRI methods, they will often tell you that the correction procedures are too lenient, and there's too many false positives being reported in the literature. Right? Their feeling is that it's too lenient. If you talk to anybody who uses these methods and does actual experiments, they will tell you that it is too harsh, and actually nothing interesting survives most of the time. So I think the latter view is far more true, that unless your study has sort of boring contrasts like pictures compared to a blank screen or something, a lot of the interesting things won't survive because it is just too harsh. So any kind of subtle contrast that would be really theoretically interesting, people often end up using ROIs. So I think this whole entire claim of correction being too lenient, I take it with a grain of salt. But in this study, we decided to do a region of interest analysis using only the ATL, so we get the maximum sensitivity, and we used a specialized scanning sequence to get better signal, so that to prevent signal loss in the ventral ATL. And what is shown here is this signal to noise ratio map, and we show that there is good signal even in the ventral medial parts of the ATL. All right, so what is the experiment? So this experiment has a couple of different twists in it, but here I will only talk about the most basic idea. And here we have these 6 conditions. One is pictures of persons, pictures of buildings, pictures of objects, numbers. These are just some arbitrary numbers, some non-words, pronounceable non-words, and then some real words. And in addition to that, we also have scrambled pictures. So the same pictures were scrambled so that it becomes, it doesn't contain any recognizable object. So that scrambled pictures can serve as controls for pictures. So I will only talk about the most basic analysis where we try to measure activation due to the non-visual, these picture stimuli that are very semantic, as well as words, and then numbers and non-words can serve as the baseline in comparison. Okay, so what do we find? So when we compare non-words and words to numbers, we find activation in the ATL. We also find activation for faces compared to scrambled images, but we don't find any activation, at least in the left ATL, or in the left or right ATL here, for buildings or objects. So it is kind of not really possible to deny that these are very highly semantic things, right? Like these objects or buildings makes complete sense. Comparing them with scrambled pictures, which is a kind of highly non-semantic condition, it still doesn't show any activation in any part of the ATL. So this kind of goes against this idea of there being a single hub region that is doing all kinds of semantics. But perhaps, okay, this is another view, and it is showing the same data. You get something in the STG, MTG. You also get some activation in the ventral part of the ATL for some of the stimulus classes, but not really for buildings or objects. And we also perhaps the activation is even smaller. So we are correcting for the whole ATL, but the hub region is not the whole ATL, only that white region in that image, so which is slightly posterior and ventral. So we decided to look at that using coordinates from other papers. So in a region of interest like this, if you plot different conditions, you find that unfamiliar words activate more than non-words, words activate more than numbers, right? So you get activation for lexical semantics, but you don't get activation for non-lexical semantics. So you don't get activation for objects compared to scrambled objects, or buildings compared to scrambled buildings, and so on. So again, even the kind of previously described hub regions doesn't seem to be doing both lexical and non-lexical processing. These are just, by the way, these are univariate analysis. Yes, we are doing multivariate analysis still to get kind of even more sensitivity. So these are preliminary results, so don't take it to the bank. But at least initially, it seems like we don't have very good, the results are consistent with our lesion study. It also showed that deficits in kind of lexical tasks rather than in semantic tasks. So there is a greater sensitivity to lexical items and to persons or emotions, but not to all kinds of semantics. And other things that, as I mentioned, we can look at more MVP analysis that can potentially provide more sensitivity in terms of detecting some pattern, and maybe the location of the hub is variable. So we use the coordinate from a previous study, but perhaps it moves around and you can search around the entire ATL to find some region. So these things are still in the works. All right, thank you. Any questions?
So what we usually do is we take the questions from the room, and then we'll look at whether there's questions online. If you get a question from the room that is from the back, please repeat the questions so the online audience can hear it.
I have a question. Excuse me, about the hit and avoid task. So you said it was related to like action planning and executive function, I think. So did you see that it was correlated with other performance on other types of sentences, or was it just specific to the action idioms? Or the action idioms?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
Okay, so the question is that the object hit and avoid task, was it correlated with other kinds of sentences or only with the action idiom sentences?
Non-action sentences.
Or non-action sentences, yeah. Yeah, so what we did was to factor out the performance on the abstract sentences. So the general kind of executive processing that is involved in processing a sentence, that is factored out.
Okay.
So and prior to the experiment, we also normed these sentences to kind of roughly equate them on difficulty. How difficult it is just to say that if they make sense. And abstract sentences were as difficult as the other sentences. So it is not simply a difficulty effect that people are impaired in processing these idiomatic sentences because they are just harder stimuli, right? So it doesn't seem to be general difficulty or executive processing effect, but specifically the difference between action idioms and abstract sentences.
Okay.
Yes.
So this may be quite an open-ended question, but I was wondering how the results from your semantic processing task relate to semantic processing in patients with like PPA, semantic variant primary progressive aphasia, for example, where the ATL is usually more damaged.
Yes, so meaning that you are suggesting that okay, so the question is how results from our semantic processing, the semantic scenario judgment task relate to results from the PPA, semantic variant of PPA where ATL is damaged, right? Right. So a lot of this kind of theory of ATL being critical comes from this type of patients. The initial results from this kind of patients that were shown to have strong semantic deficits. One issue with that, I believe, is that it is a progressive disease, and the damage is not always restricted to what we call ATL. So when you look at patients that are in the initial stages of semantic dementia, their deficits are mild and their deficits are restricted to exceptional items. So things like camels have a hump. So most animals don't have a hump, but camels have a hump. So if you ask them to draw a camel, they will draw a camel without a hump, but it will still have legs and eyes and things like that. So, or the penguin is a bird, but it doesn't fly. So their deficits are restricted to exceptional items. And that is where damage is most really restricted only to ATL. Several years later, deficits become severe, but at the time, the damage also spreads more posterior. So I think that a lot of the patients that show severe deficits have damage in like mid part of the temporal lobe, mid fusiform gyrus, middle part of the middle temporal or inferior temporal gyrus, and that may be responsible for the more severe deficits if indeed the anterior part of the temporal lobe is not that critical for semantics. So with the progressive conditions, it is harder to judge because the extent of damage is variable and it keeps changing, and it's often quite more extensive than thought. Yes.
Regarding the last study, it was really interesting. I was surprised to see that the non-word condition showed activation in the ATL in an area that we're arguing is more geared toward meaningful objects or words and all that. Why do you think that non-words were showing activation in that area?
Right, yeah. So the question is that why are non-words showing activation in this kind of putative semantic hub type of area? And that also I can only guess. I wasn't predicting activation by non-words, but I think that because if non-words, we try to make pronounceable non-words, and so they oftentimes have some similarity to real words. So when we process a non-word, it can activate some type of phonological neighborhood of the word, which will include some real words, and that might lead to activation. So I think a more appropriate comparison, that's why you often see that almost always, published studies in ATL never use non-words as a baseline. They always either use scrambled visual images or they use numbers. So I think numbers is a better baseline because that tends to show. So if you look at so here if you see numbers, here numbers have a kind of the lowest activation in this region. So I think neighborhood, probably there is a phonological neighborhood that activates some level of word-like representations maybe. So probably not the best, most ideal baseline. Unless we choose non-words that are completely non-pronounceable and kind of just consonant strange or something like that, then it would. Yes.
So I was wondering about the complexity of lexical decision versus the semantic similarity judgment and the Palm's impairments test. So on the one hand, you might think lexical decision would be really easy because it's just a single stimulus. You make a judgment about stimulus, and the other ones you have to do a bunch of comparison between, keeping in mind the top one is your target. You have to remember the other two are the ones you're comparing against, and you have to choose one of those. But on the other hand, you don't, in those cases, you have an answer in front of you, you have to choose one, whereas in lexical decision, you don't. You have to sort of search your own mind. Can you comment a bit about the complexity of those tests and how you are thinking about those from your perspective and how you might think about controlling that kind of complexity difference?
Right. So it's a good question. So the question is that usually we think of the semantic similarity and the pyramids and parameters task as more complex because they have three words, three stimuli in the first place, then you are required to compare, make a comparison, then choose a correct response and then make the response. Versus in lexical decision is easier task because you have a single stimulus, there is a single response, so there is no comparison or executive process involved. But lexical decision can be thought of as more complex in the sense that the answer is not in front of you. You are not choosing between some available answers, but you are supposed to come up with an answer on your own. So in that sense, perhaps you can consider that as more complex. And I agree, yeah, that complexity is always difficult. So if we have to define it in some way, people define it in terms of reaction time and accuracy, right, always. And if you look at accuracy and reaction time, always lexical decision is far higher than the other tasks. So in that sense, it depends on your measure, complex. So if your measure is really this type of behavioral measures, then I haven't seen any kind of behavioral measure that will tell you that lexical decision is more complex. But nonetheless, it has this element of having to decide when sort of answer is not in front of you. And you are required to kind of compare within your knowledge base whether this item exists or not. So it requires searching of your lexicon. So in that sense, it relies more on memory. So it is kind of has a greater load on memory, you might argue, than the other tasks. So I agree with that completely. And I think that anterior temporal lobe probably has a role in memory, also in short-term as well as long-term memory, and that is one of the reasons why it shows up for lexical decision. Yeah, but I think, yeah, great point.
I was not entirely sure about your interpretation of the connectivity results from the stroke patients. Were you saying that this reflects an adaptation, so a response to the deficit, or did you imply that this kind of processing would always be already bilateral in non-stroke participants? I just didn't quite catch that.
Okay. Okay, so the question is whether the right hemisphere connectivity results in stroke patients, does that imply that this is a response to stroke? Connectivity is being used in response to stroke, or the processing is always bilateral? Yeah. So it's a good question. I don't have a definitive answer for that. I think that processing is always bilateral, but much more strongly left lateralized. So right hemisphere will have some contribution, but it is not used much. If the left hemisphere is working well, you don't need to access that very often, unless there are some excessive task demands or you need some more novel or difficult response, then right hemisphere might be leveraged more. But in response to damage, then the contribution of right hemisphere is kind of ramped up through connectivity. So if you can't do the task at all, then use whatever you have left. So you are kind of going into your saving account, so to speak, to accomplish the task. But yeah, that's a good question. I don't know how you would test that exactly. With fMRI, you can see the degree of laterality, of course, but other than that, with the imaging, yeah, you can always argue that it's activated, but it's not really used. So it's more activation doesn't mean there is more actual use.
We don't have questions from online, so unless there's more questions from here, thank you very much.